Everybody in the valley knew Silas Crane was finished. I knew it too, and I'm just the man who mended his fences. 41 years old, a widower's face on a bachelor's frame, and a cabin sinking into the Wyoming mud like it had given up before he had. He owed the bank in Cheyenne more money than the whole ridge was worth. He'd sold his good horse. He'd sold his mother's clock. And in the spring of 1889, when the notice came that the bank would take the land unless he could prove it was worked, settled, and productive, Silas Crane did the only thing a desperate man with no options left could do. He put an advertisement in a Missouri paper for a wife. Not for love. He said so plain, right there in the ink, because Silas never could lie even when lying would have saved him. He needed a name on a marriage line and a body at a homestead so the inspector would sign the paper. One small task, one signature. A season, maybe two, and then she could go with a little money and no hard feelings. What he got off the eastbound coach was a woman named Adeline Fortune, who stepped down into the mud in a gray dress with mended cuffs, looked at the ruin he called a home, looked at the broken man who owned it, and smiled like she'd just been handed the deed to heaven. I didn't understand that smile for a long time. By the time I did, she'd turned that dying cabin into something the whole territory came to see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it started, the way I saw it, from the fence line where I stood with my hat in my hands, wondering what in God's name that woman knew that the rest of us didn't. Part 1. The coach came in late, of course. I was there because Silas asked me to be, and because I hadn't the heart to say no to a man that far down. My name's Josiah Bell. I fix things. Fences mostly, gates, the occasional roof if a man can pay, which Silas couldn't, so I did his for the price of nothing and the promise of nothing, which is a price I've paid many times in my life and never regretted more than twice. I keep a log, always have. Little leather book my daughter gave me before the fever took her, and I write in it every night whether the day earned the ink or not. Most days it doesn't. That day it did. April the 9th, I wrote later, Silas got married. God help them both. But that's the end of the beginning. Let me back up. Silas stood by the coach road in a coat he'd brushed so hard the nap had worn shiny, and he kept touching his collar like it was strangling him. He'd cut himself shaving. There was a fleck of dried blood on his jaw, and I didn't tell him, because a man about to meet his wife has enough to worry about without me pointing out he's bleeding. She'll take one look and get back on, he said. He said it 3 or 4 times. She'll take one look, Josiah. Maybe. You're supposed to say she won't. I don't say things I don't know. He laughed at that, a short unhappy sound, and went back to strangling his collar. When the coach finally crested the rise, Silas went so still I thought he'd stopped breathing. The wheels ground down through the mud. The horses blew and stamped. And the door opened, and down came Adeline Fortune, 36 years old, 5 foot nothing, carrying one carpetbag that had been repaired so many times it was more thread than leather. She looked at the cabin first. That was the thing I noticed. Not at Silas, at the cabin, at the sagging roofline and the collapsed corner of the porch and the field beyond gone to thistle and rock. She looked at all of it slow, the way a doctor looks at a wound. And then she looked at Silas. "You're Mr. Crane," she said. I'm yes, ma'am." He'd forgotten every word he owned. "There's things I should say plain." "You said them plain in the letter." Her voice was even, not cold, just even like a table that's been leveled with care. "You need a wife for the inspector. You'll pay my passage back come autumn. No obligations of the—" she paused and something flickered at the corner of her mouth. "Of the domestic kind. I read it. I came anyway. So the terms are settled and we needn't stand in the mud discussing them." Silas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Is there coffee?" she asked. "There's," he swallowed. "There's chicory. I can't afford the real." "Chicory's fine. I've drunk worse." And she picked up her own carpetbag before either of us could reach for it and walked toward the dying cabin like she already lived there. I wrote that night. She didn't flinch. Not at the house, not at him. A woman who doesn't flinch is either a fool or has already survived the worst thing that will ever happen to her. Mrs. Crane is no fool. The wedding was 3 days later, in the front room of the Cheyenne courthouse, with me and the clerk's wife for witnesses. Adeline wore the gray dress. Silas wore his shiny coat. The judge said the words in under 4 minutes, and I timed it out of nervousness. And when it was done, Silas stood there holding his new wife's hand like he'd been handed something fragile and hadn't been told where to set it down. "Well," Adeline said, drawing her hand back gently, "that's the small task then. Shall we go home and see about saving it?" That was the first time I heard her say home. The inspector wasn't due until the fall, and any sensible arrangement would have had the two of them simply waiting him out, patch the worst of the roof, put a curtain in the window, look settled enough to pass. That was the whole of Silas's plan. Survive to autumn, sign the paper, part ways. Adeline had other ideas, and I learned the shape of them the following week, when she asked me to drive her to town. She'd found something. In the loft of the cabin, under 40 years of dust and a dead man's junk. Because Silas had bought the place off a widower's estate and never once climbed up to look, she'd found crates. Glass jars, hundreds of them packed in straw, a copper still, dismantled, and ledgers, water-stained but legible, in a dead woman's careful hand. "The woman who lived here before," Adeline said, spreading a ledger across my wagon seat, tracing a line of figures with a chapped finger. "She was a preserver, jams, pickles, tinctures. She sold to the mining camps. Look here, look what the camps paid. They'd pay anything, Mr. Bell, because there's not a green thing to eat within 40 miles of a silver mine, and men get the scurvy and die of it." She looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen. "She had a business, a good one. And then she died, and her fool husband let it rot in a loft, and sold the land to a man who never looked up. Silas doesn't know about any of this. Silas," she said, folding the ledger closed, "looks at his boots when he walks. It's why he's poor. A man who never looks up never sees what's over his head." A pause. "I don't say it cruel, I say it true, and I intend to teach him different. I should tell you about her hands. I noticed them that day." Holding the ledger. They were a working woman's hands, scarred across the knuckles, one finger crooked where it had been broken and set wrong. And there was a pale band on the third finger of her left hand, not from Silas's ring, which was new, from an older ring, one she'd worn a long time and taken off not long ago. I didn't ask. You don't ask. But I wrote it down that night, and I underlined it, because a woman who comes west to marry a stranger for a business arrangement has left something behind her, and the shape of what she left tells you the shape of who she is. Here is the thing I most want you to understand, and it's the thing that took me longest to see. Adeline Fortune did not save that homestead because she loved Silas Crane. Not at first. She saved it because she had nowhere else to put the enormous, terrible engine of her will, and a dying homestead was the only thing in 1,000 miles that would hold still and let her. She rose before dawn. She cleared the thistle field by hand, hauling rock into a wall that I helped her lay when my own work allowed. She resurrected the dead woman still and stood over it in the July heat until the sweat ran off her chin, and she made her first batch of preserves from wild chokecherries that Silas said weren't worth the picking. They were worth the picking. The first mining camp she sold to bought every jar and asked for more. And Silas, I have to be fair to Silas changed, slowly, like a field thawing. At first he just watched her, baffled, half afraid, a man who'd braced for a season of polite misery and instead found a whirlwind living in his loft. But somewhere in that summer he started rising when she rose, started hauling rock beside her without being asked. He was clumsy at it, and she was short with him, and I watched more than one supper eaten in flinty silence across that little table. But one evening in August I came by with a mended gate hinge, and I saw them through the window before they saw me. She was showing him how to seal a jar, the wax, the cloth, the twist of the wrist that made it airtight, her hands over his hands. And Silas, who'd looked at his boots his whole life, was looking at her face like a man learning to read. I didn't knock. I left the hinge on the porch and drove home and wrote, "Something is happening in that house that neither of them has a name for yet. I'll not be the one to name it." The setback came in September, 3 weeks before the inspector. A writer came up from Cheyenne, a lawyer's man, slick with soft hands and a hard mouth. The bank had found out. Not about the marriage was legal. About the money. Word had spread through the camps that the Crane place was selling preserves hand over fist, and the bank, which had written Silas off as a dead loss, suddenly remembered it held the note. They didn't want the land anymore. They wanted the business. And there was a clause, there's always a clause, that said improvements to the property during the term of the loan accrued to the lender's benefit. The lawyer's man laid it out on the little table where I'd watched them seal jars. If they signed, the bank would forgive the debt and take the preserving operation, keeping Silas on as a tenant. A wage. Nothing more. Everything Adeline had built, handed over to men in Cheyenne who'd never picked a chokecherry in their lives. "Or," Adeline said, "or we call the note in full, which you cannot pay." He smiled. "You've a week to decide. Though I think a woman in your position would be grateful for the wage. You've no legal standing here at all, you understand. The marriage was a fiction for the land office. Everyone knows it. A judge would see it in a moment." That was the moment. If you've waited for the one morally heavy decision, that's where it lived, in the silence after that soft-handed man said everyone knows it. Because he was right. The marriage was a fiction. Adeline could walk away clean. She could take the season's money, her share by any honest reckoning, and go back east or go anywhere and leave Silas to the bank and the boots he'd stared at his whole life. She owed him nothing. The contract said so in Silas's own honest ink. One small task. No obligations. I know she thought about it. I know because she told me later that she stood at the crossroads that whole night, carpetbag half-packed, one foot already gone. But here's what I saw with my own eyes the next morning, when I came by with dread in my chest, sure I'd find her gone. She was in the field, laying rock. And Silas was beside her. And the carpetbag sat on the porch, still packed, and stayed packed on that porch for another day, and then she carried it back inside, and neither of them ever said a word about it to me or, I think, to each other. She'd chosen to stay and fight for a man she'd been paid to leave. I didn't know yet how she meant to fight, but I knew that morning, watching a small scarred woman set a stone into a wall with a bankrupt man kneeling in the dirt beside her, that the bank in Cheyenne had made a serious mistake. They thought they were dealing with Silas Crane. They had no idea what had come off that eastbound coach. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what makes a person dangerous. Not guns. I've known men with guns who were no more dangerous than a fence post. Danger is patience wed to purpose. It's a person who has already lost the thing they feared to lose and so has nothing left to bargain with but their whole self, laid flat on the table. That kind of person doesn't bluff. They don't need to. Adeline Fortune was the most dangerous person I ever met, and she never once raised her voice. The morning after the lawyer's man rode off with his week's ultimatum, she didn't lay rock long. She washed her hands at the pump, dried them on her apron, and came to find me where I was rehanging the barn door. "Mr. Bell," she said, "I need to go to Cheyenne, and I need you to teach me something on the way." "Teach you what?" "The names of every mining outfit within 100 miles, who owns them, who supplies them, who they hate." She said it plain as a grocery list. "You fixed fences for all of them. You know the country the way the bank's men never will. They think the value here is a woman's jam. They don't understand what the jam is." "What is it?" She looked at me. "It's the only fresh food between here and the railhead. It's the difference between a mining crew that works and a mining crew that gets the scurvy and quits. I don't sell jam, Mr. Bell. I sell the thing that keeps a $100,000 silver operation from grinding to a stop. A small breath. The bank sees a widow's hobby. I mean to show the camps they've been getting their lives saved for the price of a preserve jar, and that a bank in Cheyenne is about to take the woman who saves them and put her behind a desk. I set down my hammer. "Mrs. Crane," I said, "you're not going to fight the bank." "No," and there it was again, that flicker at the corner of her mouth. "I'm going to make the bank's customers fight the bank. Now, will you drive me or shall I walk?" I drove her. Of course I drove her. I'd have driven her into the ocean if she'd asked in that voice. What she did over the next 5 days I only half understood while it was happening, and fully understood only when it was done. She went camp to camp. Not to the owners, to the foremen, the cooks, the men who kept the crews alive. She brought jars. She let them taste. And she talked, quiet and level, about what would happen to the supply if the operation moved into a bank's hands and got run by clerks who counted pennies and knew nothing of chokecherry season or the way a tincture had to steep. She wasn't lying. That was the terrible force of her. Every word was true. The bank would ruin it. Clerks always ruined it. The men knew it in their bones because they'd seen it happen to a dozen other good things. By the 4th camp, the foremen were writing letters. By the 5th, a mine owner named Haggerty, a hard old Cornishman who clawed his fortune out of the rock with his own hands and hated soft-handed Cheyenne men with a pure and holy hatred, rode out to the cabin himself to shake Silas's hand and Adeline's, and to say, in front of me, that he'd buy every jar the Crane place could make for the next 10 years, contract in writing, and that he'd like to see the bank try to take a supplier out from under Amos Haggerty. He put money down, not a loan, an advance against 10 years of purchases, cash enough to pay the bank's note 4 times over. And he did it because a small, scarred woman had ridden into his camp, looked his starving crew in the eye, and understood their lives better than the men who owned them. Silas stood on the porch after Haggerty rode off, holding the bank draft in both hands, and he was crying, not making a sound, just water running down that shaving-scarred face while he stared at a piece of paper worth more than everything he'd ever owned. "I never looked up," he said, to no one, to himself. "My whole life I never once looked up." Adeline stood beside him. She didn't touch him, but she didn't move away either, and for Adeline that was the same as an embrace. The lawyer's man came back on the 7th day, expecting a signature and a broken woman. He got Amos Haggerty's contract laid on the table, and the bank draft beside it, and Adeline Fortune sitting very straight in a chair with her scarred hands folded, and Silas standing behind her, standing, for once, with his chin up. I was there. She asked me to be there, and I've never been prouder of a splinter I got sitting on that rough bench in the corner. The lawyer's man read the contract. His soft mouth got hard, then got soft again in a different, uglier way. "You've no legal standing," he said to Adeline, falling back on it, the last card. "The marriage is a sham. I could have this whole." "You could," Adeline agreed. That stopped him. "You could tell the judge our marriage is a fiction for the land office," she went on, in that level tabletop voice, "and perhaps he'd void it, and then Mr. Crane and I would be 2 unmarried people who jointly own a business under contract to Amos Haggerty, with the bank's note paid in full and no claim left on the property whatsoever." She tilted her head. "You'd have unmarried us and gained nothing. Is that the victory you rode all this way for?" Silence. "Or," she said, "you take the draft, the note's paid, everyone goes home, and you tell the men in Cheyenne that the Crane place was worth more standing free than it ever was in their hands, which is the truest thing you'll say all year." He took the draft. Of course he took the draft. There was nothing else to take. He signed the release with his soft hand shaking just slightly, and he left without his hat until Silas called him back and gave it to him, gentle, because Silas Crane could not be unkind to a defeated man, even one who'd come to ruin him. When the sound of the horse had faded, Silas sat down heavily in the chair across from his wife. "It's ours," he said. "It's really ours." "It's yours," Adeline said. The land was always yours, she stopped. And this is the part I've never told anyone. And I'm only telling it now because they're both gone and it can't embarrass them. I have to tell you something, Adeline said, about why I came. She'd been married before. I'd guessed that much from the pale band on her finger. What I hadn't guessed was the rest. Her first husband had run a preserving business in Missouri. A good one, hers really, built by her hands and her recipes and her head for figures, but in his name because that was the law and the custom. When he died, his brothers took it. All of it. The law let them, and the judge was the dead man's cousin, and Adeline Fortune, who had built the whole enterprise, was turned out with a carpetbag and told to be grateful they didn't charge her rent for the time it took to pack. I swore, she said, and her level voice cracked for the first and only time I ever heard it, that I would never again build a thing that could be taken. And then your husband's advertisement came. A breath. One small task, a season, no obligations. I thought, here is a dying place no one wants, run by a man too honest to cheat me and too poor to be worth cheating. I can build there. And when they come to take it, as they always come, I'll have lost nothing because it was never mine to begin with. She looked at Silas. I came here to build something I was already prepared to lose, she said. That was the whole of my plan, to care for nothing, to keep my heart in my carpetbag by the door. Her crooked finger touched the table, and instead I taught a man to look up, and I found I could not. She stopped again, started over. The bank offered me a wage and a clean exit, and I stood at the crossroads all night with my bag packed, and I could not make my feet go. And I have spent these 3 days furious at myself for it, Silas, because it means they can hurt me now. It means I built the one thing I swore never to build again. Silas didn't say anything clever. Silas never said anything clever in his life. He reached across the little table and put his clumsy hand over her scarred one, the way she'd once put her hands over his to teach him to seal a jar. Then we'll just have to make it too big to take, he said. They did. I'll not walk you through the years. You don't need them. You've likely driven past what they built without knowing it. The Crane preserving works grew from that one cabin loft into a concern that fed half the mining country, that put up buildings, that hired the widows and the turned-out wives and the women no one else would take, and put the business in their names, every one. Because Adeline Fortune had learned the hard way what a name on a paper was worth, and she spent the rest of her life making sure no woman who worked for her would ever be turned out with a carpetbag and told to be grateful. An empire, the newspapers called it when they wrote her up years later. Frontier empire. She hated the word. She told me so. It's not an empire, she said. We were old by then, both of us, sitting on the porch that Silas had rebuilt with his own 2 upward-looking hands before the winter fever took him. An empire is a thing one person holds. This is just, she waved her crooked finger at the buildings, the wagons, the women moving in the yard. This is just a great many people who were told they were worth nothing, finding out otherwise. That's all it ever was. That's a great deal, I said. She was quiet a while. The evening came down soft over the ridge. He wanted a wife for one small task, she said finally, almost to herself. And I wanted a place I could stand to lose. We were both such fools, Josiah. We were both so certain we were protecting ourselves. A long breath. Thank God we were wrong. I keep a log, always have. The last entry I made about them, I made the night Adeline died, 4 winters after Silas, in the bed he'd built, in the house they'd saved, surrounded by the women whose names were on the papers. I sat on that porch afterward a long time, with my little leather book on my knee and my dead daughter's gift of it heavy in my hands, and I tried to write down what it had all meant. I got as far as this. He advertised for a signature. She answered, wanting a thing she could bear to lose. Neither of them meant to. And then I stopped. I looked up at the ridge going dark, and the lamps coming on in the windows of the place they'd built out of a dying cabin and 2 guarded hearts, and I found I didn't have the words to finish it. So I didn't. Some things you leave unfinished on the page because finishing them makes them smaller. I closed the book. I sat in the dark. And I let the sentence stay broken, the way the best true things always are.